World War II did not begin with a single gunshot or a sudden declaration. It began with a collapse of trust, stability, and the international order built after World War I. The peace that followed the First World War was fragile and deeply flawed, especially in Europe. Nowhere was that more visible than in Germany, where the Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh territorial losses, military restrictions, and economic penalties. These measures did not secure peace. They created resentment. Out of that resentment emerged radical movements that promised restoration and revenge. The most consequential was led by Adolf Hitler, whose rise to power in 1933 transformed Germany from a fragile democracy into an aggressive dictatorship. Hitler openly rejected the post-war order. He rearmed Germany, remilitarized forbidden zones, and pursued territorial expansion under the promise of national revival. Crucially, much of Europe responded with hesitation rather than resistance. Throughout the 1930s, Germany tested how far it could go. Austria was annexed. Czechoslovakia was dismantled. Each step violated international agreements, yet each was met with diplomatic compromise rather than military action. This policy of appeasement was driven by fear of another global war and by the belief that Hitler's ambitions could be contained. They could not. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. This time, Britain and France declared war. World War II had begun, but it did not yet look like the global catastrophe it would become. In its early phase, the war was dominated by speed and shock. German forces used a new style of warfare known as blitzkrieg, combining tanks, aircraft, and rapid infantry movement to overwhelm opponents before they could respond. Poland fell quickly, then Denmark and Norway. In 1940, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France collapsed in rapid succession. Within a year, Germany controlled most of continental Europe. For many observers, it seemed unstoppable. But beneath the surface, the foundations of this apparent dominance were unstable. Germany had won quickly, but it had not won decisively. Britain remained in the war. The Soviet Union was uneasy, but not yet involved. The United States watched from the sidelines. By the end of 1940, the world stood at a crossroads. Europe was largely under Axis control, but the conflict was far from settled. What began as a regional war was already stretching toward something much larger. The conditions were set, not just for continued fighting, but for a truly global war. The slide into World War II was not inevitable, but it was enabled by hesitation, miscalculation, and the failure to stop aggression early. In the next phase, the conflict would explode beyond Europe and draw the entire world into its orbit. By 1941, the conflict had already devastated Europe, but it was still, technically, a regional war. That changed in a matter of months. Decisions made in Berlin and Tokyo transformed World War II into a truly global conflict, fought across continents, oceans, and societies. What followed was an escalation in scale, violence, and consequence unlike anything the world had seen before. The first turning point came in June 1941, when Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in history. Hitler believed the Soviet state would collapse quickly under the weight of a rapid ideological war of destruction. Instead, Germany opened a front that would consume the majority of its manpower and resources for the rest of the war. What was intended as a decisive strike became a war of attrition Germany could not win. At the same time, the conflict was expanding far beyond Europe. In Asia, Japan had already been fighting a brutal war in China for years. But in December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States directly into the war. Overnight, the balance of power shifted. The world's largest industrial economy was now fully mobilized for total war. Germany soon declared war on the United States, sealing the conflict's global character. By early 1942, World War II was being fought on an unprecedented scale. Axis forces controlled vast territories across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. At first, they continued to advance. Japan expanded rapidly across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. German forces pushed deep into Soviet territory, but the nature of the war had changed. Speed and surprise were no longer enough. Industrial capacity, logistics, and endurance would now decide the outcome. This phase of the war revealed a critical imbalance. The Axis powers had initiated the conflict, but they now faced opponents with vastly superior resources. The Soviet Union absorbed catastrophic losses, but continued fighting. The United States converted its economy into a war machine, producing ships, aircraft, and vehicles on a scale no other nation could match. Britain held on, serving as a base for future counteroffensives. By the end of 1942, the illusion of inevitable Axis victory had begun to crack. Their early gains had stretched supply lines and exposed strategic weaknesses. The war was no longer about rapid conquest. It was about survival in a conflict that would be decided by time, production, and resilience. World War II had become a global struggle, and the stage was set for the battles that would determine who could endure it and who could not. By late 1942, World War II had reached a breaking point. The Axis powers were still fighting on multiple fronts, but the momentum that once defined their victories was gone. What followed were a series of battles that did not just change the course of campaigns, they changed the direction of the entire war. From this moment on, the question was no longer who could expand, but who could endure. The most decisive turning point came on the Eastern Front. At Stalingrad, German forces became trapped in a brutal urban battle against the Soviet Union. What began as an offensive turned into a prolonged siege, fought street by street, building by building, through one of the harshest winters on record. In early 1943, an entire German army was surrounded and destroyed. It was the first time Nazi Germany suffered a total, undeniable catastrophe. From that moment, the German army would never fully recover. At the same time, the balance shifted elsewhere. In the Pacific, the United States defeated Japan at Midway, destroying much of its carrier fleet. This single battle ended Japan's ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations. In North Africa, Allied forces halted and then reversed Axis advances, pushing German and Italian troops out of the region entirely. These defeats were not isolated. Together, they marked the end of Axis expansion. What followed was a slow but relentless reversal. The Allies now had the initiative. The Soviet Union began pushing westward, sacrificing millions but gaining ground. The United States and its allies advanced across the Pacific island by island. Air power intensified, bringing the war directly to civilian populations and industrial centers. The conflict became increasingly destructive and increasingly one-sided. Crucially, this phase exposed the limits of ideology. The Axis powers had relied on speed, intimidation, and belief in superiority. The Allies relied on production, coordination, and adaptation. Over time, factories, supply chains, and manpower proved more decisive than rhetoric or fear. The war became a contest of systems, and the Axis systems began to collapse under the strain. By 1943, defeat was not yet inevitable for Germany or Japan, but it was becoming mathematically unavoidable. Their enemies could replace losses faster, learn from mistakes, and fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. The turning points had passed. From here on, World War II would be a long retreat for the Axis powers, fought under constant pressure. The final phase of the war would not be quick. It would be violent, costly, and devastating. But its outcome was now taking shape. By 1944, the outcome of World War II was no longer in doubt, but ending it would be brutal. The Allies launched coordinated offensives designed to crush the remaining Axis resistance on every front at once. In Europe, the Western Allies landed in Normandy on D-Day, opening a second front against Germany. From the east, the Soviet Union advanced relentlessly, destroying German armies and pushing toward Berlin. Germany was being ground down from both sides. As Allied forces moved through Western Europe, German resistance collapsed unevenly. Some units fought fanatically, others surrendered quickly. Cities were reduced to rubble. Civilian populations were caught between retreating armies, bombing campaigns, and shortages. By early 1945, Allied troops were deep inside Germany itself. In April, Berlin fell. In May, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. In the Pacific, the conflict ended differently and controversially. The United States pushed closer to Japan through a series of brutal island battles that demonstrated how costly a full invasion would be. In August 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Days later, Japan surrendered. World War II was over worldwide. The consequences were staggering. More than 60 million people were dead. Entire cities lay in ruins. The Holocaust revealed genocide carried out on an industrial scale, forcing the world to confront crimes without precedent. Europe was divided, occupied, and exhausted. Old empires collapsed. New powers emerged. Out of the devastation came a new global order. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, locked into an ideological rivalry that would shape the second half of the 20th century. The United Nations was created to prevent future global wars. Borders were redrawn, societies rebuilt, unevenly, painfully, and permanently changed. World War II was not just a conflict between armies. It was a turning point in human history. It ended one world and forced the creation of another, one still shaped by the decisions, destruction, and lessons of those 6 years of war. This was the complete story of World War II, how it began, how it was fought, and why its consequences still matter today.